Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started here. Thanks for making it the first session on Monday to talk about DNS delegation. All right, next. Next slide. So by the way, this, at least from up here, this room's a little bit noisy. I think it's something to do with the floors or the walls or something. So try to keep it quiet for the presenters up here. So we'll start off with the standard note well. This describes some of your obligations as an IETF participant, particularly as it relates to things like intellectual property and whatnot. So this is very important that everyone understands this. And next, we have the really note well, which describes some expected standards of behavior and things about anti-harassment. And if you have any concerns about that, where you can go. I'm positive that this group, based on previous experience, will be very respectful as always. So we very much appreciate that. Thank you. Next. For folks in the room, we very much encourage you or would like you to join the Meet Echo on-site tool. This, of course, helps with attendance, and also we will use this to manage queues for questions. And if necessary, we may do show of hands, so it'd be important that you're logged into that and ready to participate in those if necessary. For remote folks, please use the full Meet Echo client, but keep yourself muted until you are needed to speak or called on to speak or participate. And here's some standard resources for this meeting. If by chance you aren't aware of these already, the agenda, Meet Echo information and whatnot. And lastly, here is our agenda for today. So we're going to spend probably the bulk of our time talking about the base protocol. We'll have two presentations to kick that off, first from Tail and then from Paul. And then we've set aside, I think, 45 minutes for discussion after those two presentations. Then we'll have a presentation from Roy about authoritative delegation types, and another one from Paul about some thoughts on the include record, or the DELEG include mode, and then, if time permitting, maybe also a presentation about secure transports. So that's it, and we're ready to go with Tail. You're up first.
Howdy, all. It's so good to see you here this morning. Oh, it's funny. I had a slide clicker thing on my slide on my app before that I'd never seen, and now it's gone away. So
you can just.
I'm perfectly happy to have you click the slide.
There you go.
Oh, look at that. Slide controls. Cool. So anyway, this is a quick update of where the authors are on DELEG 01, which, or the current status of the draft, which a couple of weeks ago was published as 01. There weren't a lot of substantial changes to what the core protocol was. Again, for the core protocol, we're trying to keep it pretty slim. There was one notable new restriction put in as far as making it clear that if you have a DELEG record that is creating your delegation, you must not use NS records as a fallback, even if they are cached, because that impacts the downgrade, the protection assertions that are being made through DNSSEC being able to assign the record. There's also a new authoritative delegations type flag in the DNS key record. This is also, again, downgrade protection to make DELEG-aware resolvers aware that there should be a delegation right there. Without this flag, you could strip out a DELEG record and just present the NS records, and it would be otherwise undetectable. The extended DNS error was also added for one that signals new delegation only, as many of you have seen on the list. Oh, closer to the mic? Okay.
You can bring it up.
Yeah. I'll just crouch a little. But essentially, a number of cases were, found on the list about how does this mix between new mechanisms and conventional delegations and DELEG-aware resolvers and not aware resolvers and so on. And an interesting use case was seen where if you sent a query for a record that had for a name that had only a DELEG delegation, no NS records, but you sent it without being able to signal that you were able to understand DELEG records. And so this new flag that we're proposing would say essentially in the extended DNS errors that there is a new delegation point that exists here, but unfortunately you asked for it a way that you can't see it because it does impact some DNS proofs. Which way we respond to this. Some people are advocating for a serve fail response in this case. We still think NX domain is the proper case because if the DELEG is the only thing that exists and your resolver doesn't understand how to do DELEG, it effectively does not exist for you. There is the degenerate resolver fallback behavior in the case of serve fail would be to go ahead and ask other authoritative servers, and if they all have presumably the same zone data, they will all give you the same thing. And so just cycling through serve fails is not a useful behavior. There's also the updates, section of an RFC at the very top where it says it updates these previous standards. We note now that there are some changes to RFC 6672 and 6840 as far as the way they specify things that are actually standards changes. But mostly it was exposition and examples, and we had some of the usual typo fixes, although in reading through it for this presentation, I realized that more proofreading needs to be done. So you don't have to file issue tracker reports on that, we know. There are some more updates planned. One of the big ones that we've been discussing is this issue in Service B. It's the IPv4 hint and IPv6 hint attributes that have been as glue4 and glue6, but we are heading down a path where we're just going to call it IP4 and IP6 because we want to emphasize that when those records are present, they're not they're not glue. They're not. They could be glue, but they are not strictly speaking glue, and they're not hints. These are the name servers you're supposed to contact. And notably, also, we want to, if they're present, you don't use the NS name to contact the servers. You don't associate the addresses with the NS name because this will handle the situation where somebody tries to declare that Cloudflare's name servers have a completely different number than what Cloudflare has. But right now, it's still very much an open discussion about whether the chosen record format will require a target name in all cases. But if it does, again, we want to be clear that you only use the IP addresses. And right now, the current draft does say that you can't have a target name of the root service, the root zone. But that's still an open question. Perhaps we should remove that prohibition and say that, hey, the chosen record format we had requires a name always because reasons, but therefore dot would be okay to signal that the name in this case is not relevant. We also need to define what DELEG awareness means in the transfer protocols because there can be problems with a DELEG unaware authority having DELEG in the zone data. And so we have to, take care of that scenario a little bit more in describing what the expected behavior should be. We also currently have no security consideration section, which is kind of remarkable for something that clearly has security implications. So we have to write a meaningful one, not just the kind of perfunctory one you often see. There are no security, there are considerations. Also, per a couple of issues in the tracker, we have a situation right now where we have a very long contributors section that includes everybody's organization and contact addresses. While that's very valuable within the IETF, there's been kind of a back and forth about how you acknowledge different contributors. At the moment, it seems that we'll just probably put everybody into the acknowledgement section, and we do thank you very much for all of the help. And also there's a changelog in there that there's been some objections to that it's not nearly as good as the actual changelog that you can see on Data Tracker. And so, we'll pull that out. And then, like I said, we do have more proofreading and flow edits to do to the prose. There are a few other open issues on the GitHub tracker on the issues. One is that Petter did some work creating a matrix of what the expected behavior is when you get certain types of queries with regard to the queue type they're asking about, whether the DE flag is set, whether there's DELEG records and NS records, and what the corresponding answer would look like in all those cases. It's a very long table. However, there are probably some key similarities that we can condense, and we just have to understand, what the best way to represent this as in the document is. There's also still a question about which parts of Service B we be reusing. This is targeted for our open discussion period for everybody to chime in on how the existing Service B record factors into what DELEG record should look like. There's also the case of cyclic siblings, which is essentially these cases where glue is absolutely necessary because you're delegating to another name server where to another zone where all of its authorities are found in your zone. And so is this a use case that does need to be supported by DELEG, or is this something that we can say, you know what, you really shouldn't be doing that? And going back to the other issue that I previously mentioned, we do have to decide what the best response to be is going to be for a query which says, I don't do DELEG, but the only delegation point is DELEG. And then in addition to that, there has been this ongoing question about priming and the root zone and how would you use DELEG to do that. We don't think that this is relevant to the core protocol and should be handled by some other craft. And that was essentially it. I'm going to turn over to Paul now, who's going to talk about this whole issue with nameless delegations, and then we're going to have open discussion.
Yep. Thanks, Dan. Yeah. Yes, Brian has it. Sorry. Make sure I get the right one.
Hotels are not used to the fact that IETF people are taller in general. I said in general, you are always an outlier, Warren. So I'm going to talk now about something that has come up on the list in a couple of different threads with different names, and people got very, very agitated, not about the topic, but about the names of the threads. Glue, which gets everyone all excited. Basically, this is going to be, I'm going to say what has been proposed. I'm going to do a pros and a cons, and then I'm going to step down again because this question is just like a lot of the other questions that David just brought up. It's a general question. It doesn't need to be dealt with separately. And some of these things are very related to, if we answer one of the existing other questions this way, then we can't do this, or we can do this. It really is interrelated. But because this was so active on the mailing list recently, I wanted to bring this up. So one thing that not everyone agrees with, but all of the developers of resolvers that I've talked to agree with, is that what a resolver needs is an address, because they don't really care about the data in their cache. They care about doing something with data in their cache. So it needs at least one address, or it needs to know that it has 0 addresses for the whole thing so that it can respond appropriately. So up till now, and including now, because we're not done with DELEG yet, we have this belief in the DNS that the way you do things for delegations with name servers, DELEG gives us a chance to add something additional, not to break that, not to get rid of that, but to add something additional. So I want to emphasize, because this was totally missed on the mailing list by a couple of people, this proposal is not getting rid of names. This proposal is adding nameless addresses as another option. We may do that, we may not, but it is not the radical thing that some people thought, which was names are no longer important. They are still for many of the things. And in fact, as we discussed this more on the mailing list, many people said, oh, this is just going to be a minor thing. Well, yes, it is going to probably be a minor thing for some time in the future, and it might be a minor thing forever. All protocols have minor things in them. The question is, do you want to exclude something because it would be a minor thing? So the current draft has these options for how you get addresses. Direct, which always has to be below the delegated domain, and now we have better wording for that. And you can do that 2 ways. You can say, here's a name and an address. Great, done. Or you can say, here's a name with no address, and then the resolver goes out and queries for A and quad A records there. That's just direct. In include, which is also always outside the delegated domain, you always get a name with no addresses, and then the resolver goes out and queries for A and quad A. The proposed new option here is direct, where you have just an address and no name. And again, I'm sorry to be repetitive here, but people on the list were pretty aggressive about not hearing this. This is a proposed addition to what's on this slide, not a replacement. So when you're in direct mode in DELEG, the resolver doesn't actually need the name. It becomes vestigial, except if you're doing secure transport, which we're not discussing yet. That's a completely different draft. That will come up later. There are ways of getting names in even if we didn't do it. But if you're holding a name and an address already, the resolver really only cares about the address. So again, if there's no secure transport, or if the secure transport is using some authentication that doesn't have to be tied to the name, then an address with no name is useful to the resolver. So I've got two more slides. One is pro and one is con, and then I will sit down. So the arguments in favor of doing this is if we don't do it now, we can't add it on later. We're going to start making assumptions that everything is name-based. So it would be a good idea to add this now, even though there isn't a lot of use cases. There are some use cases for it, but if we don't add them now, those are never going to get done. And part of the reason we're in the DELEG working group is we want this new stuff. It's not hard to add. That is, that we are simply saying, in this case, either with the current draft, ignore the name, or people have been talking about different ways of having, as David said, that we might change the format of the record, things like that. This is not a hard thing to add. It is a conceptual thing to add, but mechanically it's actually fairly easy to do. And one of the arguments people made was, well, you don't really need this. You can just make up a fake name to go with your address. And the argument in favor of not forcing people to do that is they might do it wrong. So why are we giving them that option? Now, the arguments against is it's not that hard to make up a fake name. You can just pick a large random number and you stick it in front of your name servers, right? So nameless addresses are useful if you want just the address. But if people are very concerned that we need to drag a name around, it's not hard to make up a name. Just pick a random number, large random number, turn it into a label, and there you go. The other argument against nameless addresses, and I'm not completely convinced about this, but other people were having this as sort of a base argument, is right now with all the other options, you can actually synthesize backwards. So if you are a zone that is like, I'm all in on DELEG, but I need to do this other historical stuff, you can go backwards. With a nameless address, you can't step backwards. Now, again, you can step backwards by making up a name, but now you're asking, so if we do it, you are making it easier for one group. If we don't do it, you're making it easier for another. So that's it. Any of the Q&A would go into the general questions. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Tail and Paul. So as I said, we've got about 45-ish minutes or so set aside, and I'd like to open up the mic line. Oh, all right. Ben is first. Go ahead, Ben.
Good morning. Hey, so I think I do not like having an additional option here. I think that basically we should be conceptually consistent within DELEG about whether name servers ultimately are hosts in the DNS sense. Are they identified by a DNS name that itself then contains address records, or are they IP addresses? Each name server is an IP address, ultimately. I think we should be clear and consistent about that. And I think it's confusing into the future to have two different conceptual modes here that that we basically leave unresolved. So I actually do think we should entertain the more radical proposition that name servers don't have names. Essentially, we're removing a dependency cycle that was created in the original version of DNS. But I don't think we should just do both.
All right, thank you, Ben. Wes, you're up.
Thanks, Wes Hardiker, speaking only for myself. So I think one of the things that I got out of that presentation, not directing it directly to Paul, but to me, the need is not super well explained as, why this is helpful. And I think, the conclusion is, you're right, resolvers really only need an address. They just need to know where to talk to. And, by enabling caching of the DELEG record, then you still sort of get all that information. Do you really need a name anymore unless you're doing name-only resolution? What concerns me a little bit is that the pro, of, well, if we don't do it now, it'll be really hard to do later, makes sense, except that, unless we have a really clearly articulated need, then that argument no longer works for me, right? If we don't clearly say this is critical, right, we really need to do this, then why are we adding complexity when, key value pairs are certainly well understood by every coder on the planet? And I kind of like the idea of creating an algorithmically generated name, so that you just put that in and this is the standard for how you come up with the name that you should be using. Even if the resolver is going to ignore it, you can leave that decision to the resolver. But...
Thanks, Wes. Tail, go ahead.
One of the things I've been thinking about too is that the argument that if you want to renumber things but you have a bunch of names that are delegated to your name server, other zones that are using only IP addresses, this can become kind of hard. There was a misunderstanding on the list about it, but one of the things I've been thinking about where it is hard is the mixed mode, essentially, where right now, if you want to use an NS name saying, hey, this is, here's where you should get all your information about a delegation. Right now, the core protocol says you can only get that by looking at the service B record at the target. And this actually provides a little bit of a harder upgrade path in order to be able to move from NSs into DELEGs, because legacy NSs might not have. Now you're saying anything that's delegated to that has to have a service binding record, when ultimately still what you're after is the the addresses of the server you're supposed to contact. And so my somewhat radical new idea that I have not even discussed with my co-author, so very much speaking just for myself thing, is that perhaps the target of include should be, you're supposed to look up the service binding and find, that it exists or provably doesn't exist. And then failing that, then you can use the address records of the target.
Thanks, Tail. Philip, go ahead, please. Welcome.
Yes, so there's a thing I wonder about with this proposal, is that if you have an SVCB record, then in the current definition of SVCB, you get a name at the end. As far as I know, that there's no way to avoid, and I think that's putting a root that already has a specific meaning. So for DELEG, we can change the record format and say, okay, we leave out the name at the end, and that's it. But then if you use the include mode, then you start pointing to an SVCB record. So if we add this for direct, then we create something that would only work for direct. So I'm a bit worried that we create some confusion situation where some stuff will work for direct, but then if you do include, then suddenly you have to live in a different world. For consistency, if we keep pointing to SVCB records, then maybe the DELEG record should also look more like an SVCB record just for consistency. But other than that, I agree that just referring to a name server by IP address is a good thing to have, but I don't think we should have an inconsistency between direct and include.
Thank you, Philip. Joe, go ahead.
Hi, Joe Ebley. I mentioned this on the list, but I mentioned all kinds of things on the list. And it would be natural if people stopped reading my mail. But I think one of the things that is important enough to stand up and repeat is that this transition from NS type zone cuts to DELEG signal zone cuts is going to be complicated enough. We already have a world where people are already sometimes fatally confused by the concept of glue. We're talking about adding yet another kind of something. Even if we give it a different name, it's similar. It's addresses and it's name servers and it's names. And this transition is going to be long. I think it's a mistake to imagine that this is, a couple of presentations and one ISOC workshop and the world will be transformed. This is going to carry on being a transition state it's going to make DNSSEC look well deployed. So I think whatever we come up with has to be minimally confusing. And the DNS is already horrendously confusing, even to people in this room, never mind people outside this room. So whatever we do, I think, needs to be as similar as we can tolerate to what we already have. I think we need to choose the best advantages of making changes. And if we decide to change too much, we're going to find that nobody's going to use this because it's going to be such a horrendous nightmare to troubleshoot that the cost is way more than the benefit.
Thank you, Joe. Paul, go ahead.
Paul Hoffman. So I want to respond to one of the things that Wes said, which is we should only be doing things that we absolutely need. We don't need any of this, right? If the DELEG working group shuts down tomorrow, the DNS will continue to work as it's working. This is all about taking the best advantage we have in one step that will take a huge amount of time. By the way, I didn't dare use the analogy you did that, that this will make that DNSSEC will look fast relative to this, but I fully agree. I believe that having addressless names will have an effect. I have absolutely no idea how much effect that will be. I suck at predicting things, as those of you who have been around for a while know, but so do we all. And so the question is, what kind of, for me, how far are we willing to put in options now that we see some advantage to? I don't want to put in things, I don't want to say, oh, and we can put it on the blockchain with it. Like, I don't want to do things that no one has any technical reason for. But because we know that resolvers use addresses, and like a resolver whose cache threw away the names, just kept the addresses, would probably work. I wouldn't write it. I would not, modify a current one to do it, but it would probably work. Therefore, I think it's a reasonable idea. And if we don't get rough consensus in the working group to do this, I don't think that the protocol is going to be that much worse off. I think that because we have the option of making fake names, actually, for those of you who aren't watching the chat, Petter actually came up with a better fake name than I did for, just you want a name. But I think we'll be okay, but I don't want to limit ourselves now. That's why I've sort of brought this up as we won't add it later, because we can't add it later. If we say names are always necessary in the record type, we can't go back and change that later. That would be death. So let's consider doing it now.
Thanks, Paul. Petter, go ahead, please.
Hi. I want to react to a bunch of speakers. First, Philip brought up the SVCB compatibility and so on, and I think that we shouldn't be concerned about record format at all, because I think we should first define semantics and then decide what record format to use. So let's not argument with SVCB or any other existing type, please. Second, I think that the very important point is a consistency with what we have. And for me, that's actually reason to not have the name, because the name in legacy or current DNS has completely different semantics than it will have in DELEG. In DELEG, it's defined as authoritative on the parent side. The resolver doesn't care what's in the child. So if the name points into the child and it's like traditional delegation which requires glue, then in the existing DNS, the value obtained from the parent in a glue record can be rewritten by the value from child. But that's not going to happen in DELEG. So I argue that if we keep the semantics with a name which points to a child, we are actually creating more confusion because the behavior for this exact setup where the NS example com has an IP address in parent and child will behave differently in DELEG and in legacy DNS. So for me, that's the reason to not have a name on it, because if you don't have the name, there is nothing which suggests that the child can overwrite the value you've got from parent. That's my main argument for not having a name in case where the name doesn't actually mean anything in DELEG. So consistency, but seen like exactly the opposite way. That's the main argument. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Peter. Tell, welcome back.
And Joe's coming back, so this is good because actually he was what kind of provoked me rejoining the queue, not in the derogatory way. On that very issue of complexity, I think one of the things that we are trying to emphasize here about the DELEG record is that it is fully encapsulating, perhaps through indirection of service binding, but it is fully encapsulating the information you need to know about the authorities for delegation. And so to that extent that, you know, the IP addresses are there, perhaps the name is irrelevant and shouldn't be really highlighted except in cases where it might be useful for SNI, separate discussion on transports. It should be simplifying our concept of, rather than we existing situation where we have glue in the parent and you have to remember to update your parent records and everything, right? Like that has had greater operational complexity, I think, than putting all this information into the DELEG record. And then I had one other, about predicting. I also suck at predicting, but I am considerably more optimistic than Paul and Joe in that while I very much agree that NS records are going to be here for the rest of our lifetimes, I think that we're going to see more rapid uptake in DELEG than we would in DNSSEC because of the other things that DELEG is going to be able to offer delivery for, right? Like it's the analogy with DNSSEC, I think, falls apart when what DNSSEC was adding was something that a lot of people didn't actually feel was all that important. What DELEG is adding is a way to do things that people have been wanting to do.
Thanks, Dale. Joe, go ahead. Yeah.
So I actually had a comment on something that's not to do with this.
Oh.
Okay. So this is a comment on what R code a server should return if the client is not capable of ingesting a DELEG response, but the server is not capable of sending a conventional response. And I haven't followed, maybe this has been discussed on the mailing list, in which case I can sit down. But the two options, serve fail and name error, I think both have problems. The serve fail has the repeat try other servers, maybe this is futile problem. The name error is a signal that means something, and in this case, the name definitely does exist, even if we can't tell you about the child in a way that you can understand. So I don't think either of those are good answers. And I sensed in the summary that maybe name error was considered like, oh, it's probably fine. But I think it's almost certainly not fine. And I thought I just want mainly to say that I think refused would be better than a name error or not implemented. I thought form error, but it's not actually a form error. But name error, I think, is like the worst possible option. Serve fail, I think, is better than that.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. Warren, welcome.
So thanks, Warren Kamari. So I think I agree with Paul on this. I think generally people are going to be delegating to a name because that way you can like outsource your DNS and they can renumber things. But it seems like prohibiting delegating to an IP address is potentially going to come back and bite us at some point. Right? Like I've seen people in the DNS who've wanted to do it and become confused when they can't. So I don't see why we would make it really hard to do at this point. Like this is our opportunity to make stuff better. Maybe this is better.
Thanks. Jim.
Jim Reid, just a general nuisance. I think we're endangered here of perhaps trying to over-elaborate things. And we seem to be talking about various different options and possibilities here. And we end up sort of thrashing around in the fine detail of that. So I wonder if it might be appropriate to try and figure out some kind of triage mechanism to look at these suggestions and say, are these going to move the proposals forward? Are we going to make a better draft or not? Is this a desirable thing to have, or is it something that's at the margins that might just be a little bit useful? So I think it would help to try and keep us to concentrating on the main goal. I mean, some of the discussions we've been having over the last few weeks on the mailing list have not been at all productive. And that if we don't get out of that mode, I fear we're just going to keep going and going and going and not producing anything useful.
Thanks, Jim. Philip, go ahead.
Yeah, so mostly responding to something Peter said. But so in DELEG, the direct mode of delegation comes closest to what we currently have. I mean, if you currently have a name server that is in the child zone, then the resolver will just use the glue records to resolve it. And whether or not it will eventually look up something in the child zone, that depends on whether you're parent-centric or not. But basically, DELEG Direct doesn't really offer something that we don't have today when it comes to name resolution. The interesting part of DELEG is in the include thing. But what I find a bit surprising about the current discussion is that for includes, there will be a requirement to have a name, because an include will point to an SVCB record, and SVB record will have a name. So we're discussing on making a change, I think, to something that is already very similar to current delegation, and that we don't really need a DELEG for. And the interesting case where we need DELEG for, we were not going to make this change. So, and Peter said, like, well, we can do whatever we want, but we can only do whatever we want with the DELEG record. We cannot do anything we want with the include record because we point to an SVCB. So I wanted to reiterate that a bit.
Thank you, Philip. Eric, welcome.
Thanks. I think I can see pros and cons on this. I think one thing we should think about here is what the implications for having the normal case always be dual stack, of having both a v4 address and a v6 address, because hopefully that's going to be the default for ways to come. And some of the cases we might need to deal with here, like if there's any synthesis case that you need to do from an SVCP record that had been pointed to, that you could start running into challenges if you end up having to do both of them. So I think that's one thing we should kind of a possible sharp edge of this approach.
Thanks, Eric. Ben, go ahead, please.
Hey, I wanted to respond specifically to something I heard from Warren about support for outsourcing operation of name servers. I think that the right approach here is probably to say, if you are outsourcing your name server operations, that's include. You use include, and include definitely supports names. If you're using direct, then arguably that shouldn't be outsourcing. That should be a name server that you operationally control. Otherwise, you end up in bad situations where you're using direct, but you're pinning a bunch of parameters like supported protocols and potentially key fingerprints that the operator would like to be able to update or rotate, but they can't because you've pinned those values into a record in your zone. That's why we have the limitation that this is supposed to be below the zone. When there is a name in direct, that name is supposed to be below the zone cut, so that you don't start pinning these parameters on other people's name servers, basically. So I think that my favorite version of this architecture right now is to say, we don't even have an explicit direct or include flag in the record. That's not explicit in the RR type. It's implicit from whether a name is present. If a name is present, you are doing include, and we're going to chase that name. We're going to see if it has a service B record. If it does, then those parameters are going to be important. If it doesn't, then you'll get basically the defaults. And if it doesn't have a name, then you're in direct, and there'd better be some IP addresses in this DELEG record, or it's kind of null.
All right, thank you, Ben. Paul, go ahead.
Paul Hoffman. Something that Jim Reed said a little bit ago, which wasn't on any of the topics, I think is actually quite relevant, which is we are talking about, and then other people have talked about, oh, what fits in the Service B record or DELEG using Service B. One of the topics that got just one bullet on, that we need to talk about it list, which I will be talking about later, which I think really calls this in, is, are we sticking with the Service B format? And sticking with the current Service B format puts some restrictions on us, as Ben was just saying, this is how this looks and such like that. So since this is the mic line for lots of things, not just nameless addresses, I would like people to seriously think about, are we starting to talk about, do we want this feature or not, whichever the feature is, because it fits well in a Service B format or not. I have slides later where I talk about this, but hearing the mic line and seeing more of the mic line than mailing list, I think people have already gone to, this is the format because it's the format that's in the current draft. Whereas that's open, I believe, for discussion if we have features that we want.
Thank you, Paul. John, go ahead, welcome.
John Levine. Yeah, I, on the list, was complaining about what happens if I have 200 zones pointed to the same name server, which I think actually this resolves pretty well. And I've also, but now I've been thinking about all the ways that I've screwed up my DNS zones. And one of them is with stale glue, and what we have done, if we have nameless delegations, the glue goes away, which removes a way to screw things up. If we have name and address, or God forbid, fake name and address, and because I'm that sort of person, I helpfully attempt to put the fake name in the zone, but I get it wrong. We've invented yet more ways to have inconsistencies that will confuse resolvers that weren't written with that particular bug in mind. So the more I think about it, the more I basically agree with Ben, is that if the name would be in the zone, just give the IP address, and if the name's anywhere else, it's an include, which supports my use case perfectly well, because in the zone it's there, and everywhere else it'll go look it up in the zone. So yeah, I like nameless addresses. I think that names and addresses that might be wrong make things worse.
Thank you. Q, welcome.
Hello, Q Mazel. Just to throw, excuse me, just to throw an opinion in on the bike shedding of return code of error codes. My preference would be for not implemented. The RFC just says the server doesn't support this kind of query, is all that not implemented means, and this seems to match exactly to the situation we're dealing with.
Thank you. Florian, go ahead.
Florian Opser, Royal Fantasy, also root server operator. So I suppose I'm not opposed to punt the priming query to a different draft. However, I note that the base spec calls out parent 14 times and doesn't say anything that the root is special. So I think it has to say something, as in, we're punting this to this other draft and we will allow it, and not say, oh, this thing has the DELEG record type has to be in the parent side.
Thank you, Florian. Philip, welcome back.
Yeah, so taking something that Ben said about being more radical, if we so the purpose of delegating to a name is that the name can then have a quad A records that we can use to contact the name server. If we have DELEG includes, then a name in the DELEG include record refers to another SVCB record, SVCB style record that can have addresses. So that means that the DELEG include mechanism can serve the exact same purpose as normally having a name with A and quad A records. So maybe if we want to say, okay, we want to have this addresses without names, then indeed go all the way and say we don't have names anymore. If you want to have a name, then you use a DELEG include style delegation, then that will have a name, and then that again will have either associated addresses, or it in turn will be another include which goes further.
Thank you, Philip. Petter? You're muted, I think, Petter.
Once again?
Yeah, good.
Sorry. I have a bit trouble keeping track with discussing two different things at the same time, but to the annex domain versus self-fail versus not imp or whatever R code, we respond to legacy clients who ask for the only delegation. I want to reiterate that the only possible option which doesn't cause retries is annex domain, because that's the only value which will actually validate on the legacy client. Anything else, no error, not imp, whatever you choose, will cause retries. So basically, operators, make up your mind whether you want to have retries and the same query on all your servers every time anyone asks single query or not, because that's basically the decision. Either we get an X domain with a TTL which can be cached, and anything else will cause validation failure and retries to all your other DELEG servers. So that's the decision here to make. It's not like cosmetic question, it's a technical question about the performance of the whole thing.
Yeah, thank you, Petter. Roy.
Roy Adams, something that Florian said earlier about 13 references in the current draft pointing to, sorry, I apologize, 14 references in the current zone. I think we can remove all child-parent references if we just talk about records that are authoritative at a delegation point, right? So we don't focus on where these might be from your perspective of the current zone. These records only exist at a delegation point. So that's a much easier discussion. We don't have to talk about how do we solve this for priming. We still have to solve that, but not in the context of a DELEG record, not in the context of a delegation point in the current zone, in the zone where you plan to deploy a DELEG record. I will adhere to that in the presentation later, so we don't have to continue to discuss this here at this moment, but I just want to point it out that the parent part can go away. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Roy. Mark, go ahead, welcome.
Mark Andrews, ISC. A couple of items. The annex domain won't be cacheable. We've got no caching information. We do not have an SOA record. This will not work. It'll be just as bad as refused, not imp, anything else. The only result will end up coming out is serve fail. 2308 gave us ability to cache an X domain, but that requires that there is an SOA record to return. And we do not have an SOA record being returned from the parent server. An NX domain is just the wrong R code anyway. Now, if we want a different R code, we need a new error code, and we need an SOA record with the timer on it. And that needs to be able to make it through. But old name servers will not cope with that. They'll be just an arbitrary R code, and we don't know what to do with it, so they'll serve fail. Personally, I don't want to see a delegation that does not support legacy name servers ever. We are doing the wrong thing by the DNS to do that. Okay. On the other issue of nameless delegations, we are losing the information to actually correct delegations and verify the DELEG record if there is not a name associated with an address. We got into this problem because registries are not doing what was required by RFC 1034, which is actually to check delegations all the time, periodically. There is nothing in a, I know it's an old issue, but there is no registry that cannot check every delegation every 24 hours and ensure that the NS records are consistent, and that the glue that is published is consistent, and that cannot send a message to the registrant that they have an error. We are fixing the wrong problem, and nameless delegations are just going to mean that there's no ability to actually check anything. What address should be there? You look at a DELEG record and the name field is dot or nothing. What is the correct address that should be there? I don't know. I can't check from outside. We are setting ourselves up to fail. Please keep the names associated with addresses so checking can be done. Yes, I know in NameD we do have things like stub zones where we put addresses in, but that's really ad hoc configuration and is very error prone. And yes, we do nameless delegations in inverted commas with them, but I do not encourage it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Peter, welcome.
Hello, Peter Thomason. On the question of nameless delegations, I think that's fine, but I really want to talk about the return code problem for the DE0 case when there is a DELEG-only delegation. Various people have said various things about which return code would have what sort of property and lead to retries or not, and caching and all of that. It seems like there is no optimal return code that gives the behavior that is cacheable and doesn't cause retries and is not misunderstandable. I think not implemented doesn't work either because it's for DE=0 conventional queries, which are implemented typically. The question is really, or the problem really is that the part of the namespace is not reachable. And so I don't know if that deserves a response code at all. It reminded me of Joe Abley's zone cut to nowhere draft, which would be an NS sort of delegation where the NS target is just the root label. So it indicates that there is a zone cut here, but I don't have a useful name server to tell you in the old NS model. And I think the way Joe intended it in his draft is for like split horizon scenarios where there is an internal name server perhaps, and you want to do like a DNSSEC trust carve out or something by introducing a zone cut. I think it's fine to signal that there is a zone cut in DELEG only delegation scenarios by faking the NS record, so to speak. I don't know what implications that would have, like if it always would work with like the NSEC type maps, all of that stuff. I think we have to think that through, but I wanted to float the idea again because I think it seems to be signaling the right property and it doesn't have the different problems that the return codes have.
Thanks, Peter. Petter, go ahead.
Hi. Peter Thomason just said that an explicit signal that you cannot reach it makes sense. And my question now is, so why is EDE code not sufficient? Because we can define EDE code which exactly says what is happening and it doesn't have any of the caching and retry issues. So why is the EDE code not sufficient? Can people explain, please?
Thanks, Petter. Carl, go ahead.
So just on the nameless delegations, from a registry point of view, and notwithstanding you may want, I may need to offer opt-outs, I may need permission, etc. But if I have a name and an address, I can synthesize NS records for resolvers that don't support DELEG. If I don't have a name, I can't do that.
Petter, are you back? Yes.
If I can. Well, I don't see why you couldn't synthesize name if you don't have a name. I mean, it's exactly what Paul Hoffman had in his presentation. Of course, you can synthesize name and you can put it in your own zone. So everyone, you know, it can be like syntheticglue.uk and then random name in front of it. And then everyone can see with plain sight that this is synthetic glue you made up just for NS. So technically you can do it. Maybe you are unwilling, but then please elaborate why.
Thanks, Petter. All right, so we've reached the end of the queue, temporarily at least. I think we're doing pretty good on time. So if folks have any other topics they want to discuss about the base protocol or the two presentations, I'll give you one more chance to speak up, join the queue. Otherwise, we can move on to other things. So I see Florian's coming to the mic. Go ahead, Florian.
Yeah, Florian. Since we're all bored here, I thought I'd ask the authors what they're thinking about the rest info draft. So Eric had suggested it should go into the base protocol, but that's also supposed to be stripped down. So I don't know. You have no idea what I'm talking about.
My response is I had.
Can you repeat the question? It was a little bit hard because Florian turned away from the mic. So
yes. So I have a REST info draft which informs a client that a resolver supports DELEG, and you need that if you use a resolver as a forwarder. So if a resolver speaks DELEG, speaks to a forwarder that does not speak DELEG, things go sideways. I wrote a draft for that. Our AD Eric pointed out that the working group is not actually chartered for that and suggested, hey, this can go into the base draft. And I'm asking the authors what they think about that.
Thank you, Florian.
And as one of the four authors, I can say I personally haven't looked at it yet, and the authors have not discussed it amongst themselves. However, the other authors might have independent opinions already from having looked at it. So.
All right. So I don't see anybody coming to the mics on that topic. So I guess we can talk about that more on the list, hopefully. And all right. So who's up next? Is it Roy? Yeah. Roy, are you ready to present your slides here?
So what I'm about to present is nothing new. This has been discussed before. I'm going to talk about the idea of not just allocating one, but the whole range. All right. Do I need to repeat or shall I continue?
He did. Sorry? You're good.
Okay,
Yeah.
good. All right. So this is about allocating a range of types. But let me recap. We are here because we find that DNS delegations have limited functionality, right? The hostname resolves to an address, and if you want more information, you're kind of stuck. With new requirements, secure transport, operational flexibility, error reporting, sorry, I put that in, additional change of trust, etc., etc. So the goal is to modernize this delegation stuff without breaking compatibility, right? And we want to allow evolution. And I want to stress the allow evolution part. So I want to step back from just talking about the DELEG record and specifically about the right-hand side of this DELEG record. We already know that, at least in my, I need to sidestep a little bit. What I've done in the past, or what I'm still doing, is I happen to be one of the RR type experts That means that if someone is asking for a new RR type, it comes to a group of 4 people. Ray Bellis is one of them, I'm one of them, and we evaluate these things. And so there's a bit of history that I have and a bit of experience that I have with evaluating these things and to see if they're future-proof or not. Now, ignore that completely, but that's at least my perspective. So I know that if we design something that's called next, right, then in a couple of months, couple of years, we will have something called NSEC. And then maybe in a couple of years, we'll have something that's called NSEC 3. And yes, I'm guilty of NSEC 3, for which I deeply apologize. But I foresee similar things with DELEG, right? I don't want to exclude that right now we only want to have a DELEG type, and I will get to that a little bit later. So basically, I'm talking about protocol modifications for delegation extensions. In a similar way as we had protocol modifications for security extensions. I would call these records, and that's the name I coined myself, feel free to completely ignore it or bike shed with me on the list, authoritative delegation type records, very similar to what DS records do. They need some scaffolding, some retrofitting. This is already alluded to by Till. You need the EDNS 0-bit, you need a DNS key flag, you need an NSEC record or an NSEC 3 record to prove non-existence in a delegation response. I already talked about this, about design lessons. A beautiful example is, by the way, SRV. There's a section in Service B record of why of the difference between SRV and SVCB. But I'm sure that at the time that people were developing the SRV record, they thought they were done. And I remember some of the discussions of the past. And do we need it more extensible, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, they couldn't foresee what we know now, that we want to have key value pairs, right, in a record in order to have more free-form binding. Anyway, as we know now, retrofitting is costly. Things will take a longer time to implement. Can you imagine if we have a DELEG 2 in the future, right? Oh, sorry, a DELEG 3 in the future. Then we need yet another flag. We need yet another signal. And it can become very, very ugly. Do I remind anyone of RSA SHA-1, NSEC 3 SHA-1? That's algorithm 6 or maybe 7 for security algorithms. So it can be very ugly if you want to do this again in the future. The other option is the other extreme. Instead of doing something new in the future with a new type and retrofitting that again, we could use existing type. We can shoehorn everything in text records. Now for DELEG that doesn't work. We could shoehorn everything in a DS record. That will become very, very ugly as well. So to avoid these two options, right, doing everything again in the future, or shoehorning everything in DS records or in a DELEG record, we can just assign a range of new types. And then allocate the DELEG record as the first of that range of type. So what I'm proposing is basically, and keep in mind, I'm not talking about specific DELEG records, but now about the whole range. Make it more general. Use the DNS key flag and EDNS DE for signaling for this range. Use NSEC 3 for secure proof of absence. And these two things are already in the current IETF DELEG draft. And then, yeah, I want to propose, and I would love to discuss that with you, and I hope there is some time to assign a range, and we can bike shed about how big that range is, where that range will be in the type code space. But that's not important for me right now. For me right now, it's important that we allow for future extensibility in a way that's not just DELEG. I say our proposal, but my proposal here really is having two separate documents, right? One document that basically talks about this retrofitting, really the protocol modifications for delegation extensions, right? And then it's basically the current draft, but just get this retrofitting, make that a separate one, and then talk about specifically about the DELEG record, the right-hand side, right, of what it provides in yet another record. I'm I'm happy to step back and let that continue. The last thing I wanted to say is I put in a draft. I blatantly copied it from Peter and Peter. Peter van Dijk is here, I think. And the reason I did that is to be able to get a talking slot here, because the idea within the IETF, if you have a draft, you can get mic time, and I really wanted mic time for this. Anyway, that's it. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Roy. Questions for Roy? Eric was first off the line, so welcome.
Okay, Eric Vink, the responsibility, since Warren is no more the responsibility for this group. I think that the idea is nice. I'm not sure whether DELEG is the right place for this draft. It's not in the charter, basically.
All right.
We can talk, right?
Yeah.
Thanks. Paul?
Paul Hoffman. So to answer your question, I believe it is in the charter in the sense that if we didn't do this, we would have to do it later and retrofit. And therefore, since we have all of the bits in the current draft, and current draft is clearly in the current charter, I think what Roy, from my understanding, what Roy is saying is we want to reserve a space and then do exactly what we're doing. And that's why he had asterisks on the last slide. Let me before you answer, let me say what I got up to the mic to say, which was when I was talking with Roy yesterday, he said one thing to me, which was not on these slides, which really helped me understand the context, which is if you look back at 4033, 4034, 4035, 4035 separately is changes to existing protocol. It's not all the bits on the wire. And this is sort of a parallel to that. And so I think that having that as a separate document actually makes sense for future people who are coming in who just assume, 20 years from now, oh, DELEG exists and such like that. So I do think that this would actually fall in the charter because what we're saying, part of what the current draft says is, how are we changing things? And what Roy's proposing is, we are changing things in this range of our R types.
So my voice is kind of broken. So I think having a separate draft does make sense, right? And again, I like the idea personally, but not in DELEG. I think DNS up for this draft is a much better place. And it's a short could be done way before DELEG. So DELEG could pick up a code. I mean, maybe I'm pessimistic there, or optimistic, I don't know.
I'm not going to respond to that. I'm going to think about it for a while and respond to you on the list, if that's all right. Sure. Thank you.
Peter, go ahead, please.
Hi, once again. I want to rephrase what Paul Hoffman just said. Basically, everything we need to do for DELEG, well, in other words, there is only single difference between what we need to do to make DELEG happen in this working group, which is chartered to do that, and what Roy and me are proposing. And the only difference is that instead of one number, we take 100 or any other number. So if you say that we are not chartered to take two numbers instead of one, I think it's like ridiculously being lawyer. It just technically doesn't make any sense. Because if we are chartered to make the technical changes we need to make DELEG happen and implement it, it doesn't really make any difference whether we take one number or two or 100 or 1,000. It's like on technical level, that just doesn't make any sense.
Thanks, Peter. Joe, go ahead.
Joe Abley, I think I'm missing something. So your proposal is just to say we want to reserve a range of numbers, code points, to be used now and in the future for new delegation types.
That is correct, yes.
So I'm confused, right, to be used in the parent. So I'm confused as to why that's useful and what problems that solves, that just allocating a new code point each time in the future a new idea comes up, what the problems with that would be.
I can go into that right now if you like. So the current draft specifies that an NSEC or NSEC3 response is only needed for type DELEG, right? For when you need to prove the absence of type DELEG. So if there's a type DELEG, you don't need an NSEC and NSEC3 record. In the future, if you have a DELEG2 record, right, how do you prove that it's not there? You can't ask for this NSEC record, right? So you need some new scaffolding there. You need, for the same reason we have a flag in the DNS key, right? You need to have a new flag by that time to signal that there should be an NSEC3 record. So that's one. I mean, this is getting very complicated on this specific matter, but I can give you a simpler explanation. In the future, secondary servers, for instance, they do not need to know, if my proposal is accepted, right? They do not need to know specifically what a delegation type looks like on the right-hand side. They can be opaque. Remember unknown RRs? We can now do unknown RRs for this range. So I don't need to know the right-hand side. I don't need to do anything special that I'm already doing for DS and DELEG. I just need to do the same special stuff for things in this range. If we don't do this now, then in the future, we need to do something special again for that new type we're developing. So I just want to reduce the overhead that we're introducing right now for this record and reuse that reuse that technology that we're inventing for future types. So we remove that overhead. I hope this helps. I'm happy to have the discussion in private as well.
Jim, go ahead.
Roy, I think this is a very interesting idea, and it's certainly worth exploring further. However, I disagree with what Paul had said before. I think this work should be done in the DELEG working group. If you need some special resource record type for the purposes of the DELEG work, then let's just assign a code point for it and get on with the work for DELEG. But this generalized framework idea you're talking about has got a much bigger and much wider remit and bigger ramifications on the DNS that go far beyond the scope of the DELEG working group. So to go with what Eric had said earlier, is take this to DNS op in the first instance, but maybe at some point in the not too distant future, we'll have another DNS working group which focuses on protocol extensions and updates, and that would ultimately probably be the home for that work. I really don't think we should do this inside DELEG because, first of all, DELEG's got enough to contend with, and this will just muddy the waters even further.
Thank you for, can I respond?
Yeah.
Jim, before you walk away.
Sorry.
So my intent here was to make folks aware that we could do this now. I'm happy to do this in DNS op. I'm happy to do this in DELEG. I'm just following the leadership of our chairs and our area directors. I do agree with Peter, what he just said on screen, that it from 50 mile high up, right?
Yeah.
It looks like instead of one, we reserve a range. But I get it, that range is not really useful for specific DELEG itself and the DELEG record that we now talk about in this working group. Things at the delegation point that we're talking about that might be useful for the future, that range can be allocated through DNS op. I don't mind. Give us some guidance. We can discuss this on the list. So yeah. I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm not agreeing with you. I'm just waiting for directions to where to put this.
Okay, Roy, thanks.
Thanks, Jim.
All right. Peter, go ahead again, please.
Thank you for giving me the time. I want to explain from the high level why this makes sense. Right now, if we go ahead and make a DELEG protocol, then the DELEG aware resolver, which forwards to some other resolver, needs to have DELEG awareness on both sides. Otherwise, it will break for various reasons. What this proposal does is that if we have the range and we do DELEG version number 1 today, we will eventually get DELEG version 1 aware resolvers all around. And 20 years from now, someone else will come up with a DELEG version 2, but they will not have the deployment problem because we have the range in the spec which specifies the protocol behavior. And then the DELEG version 2 aware resolver will be able to use the DELEG version 1 aware resolver to talk without any breakage. And that's the value of this proposal, that we will simplify deployment in future if there is some future protocol. It's essentially the same problem with DS, right? If you are DNSSEC validator, you need to use DNSSEC aware resolver to get the records. And if you don't have DNSSEC aware resolver, it will explode in interesting ways. So this proposal is about preventing this from happening again in future. That's the high level explanation.
Peter, I want to add to that, and also what Eric said before. If we split protocol modifications out of the DELEG draft, because it's a DNS protocol modification, and we allow for that to be a range instead of a type, then that entire discussion of eDNS 0, of DNS key signal, that should happen in DNS operations, right? And then this working group is reduced to just, not reduced, improved to just talking about the right-hand side of a specific DELEG record. That's I want to give you that argument. So, Victor, go ahead.
Yes. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Victor.
Okay, thanks. I'm mostly supportive for a small range. The reason I say small is, first of all, the support is because if we don't clearly know which side a record lives on, whether it's parent side or child side, resolvers are going to have a lot of trouble validating it correctly, right? They'll get the wrong, what they think of as the wrong NSEC proof. And then the data will sort of fail, and all sorts of things will break in a resolver chain. So certainly we should be quite clear to all resolvers whether they understand the record or not. They should know which side it lives on, because they can validate it without knowing its meaning, just by computing a signature and checking it. So we do want that clarity. However, parent-side records presumably are mostly about controlling delegation, right? Why else would you have a parent-side record? So I don't think it makes sense to have a range of hundreds or thousands of parent-side records. If the record at all affects where you get the data about the zone, if it actually changes delegation, then if the resolver in the middle doesn't understand it, it's in any case going to give you bad answers, because it's going to get them from the wrong place or by the wrong means. So I don't see a compelling need for a lot of these, right? I think a range of 5 might well be, sufficient forever, or even less. Maybe even 1 is enough. Do we really see a compelling need for future parent-side records?
All right, Philip. Victor, I just read the screen. Philip is next, but I want to respond to Victor if that's all right. So I started off by saying we can bike shed this on the list, but since someone mentioned it now, the size of the range, we have 64K types available. Even if you take away the stuff that is assigned right now, we still have kind of 64K types available. So if it's 5, I think we're limiting ourselves. It would be nice if it's an order of 2, right? So that would be 4, right? But I think in the range of between 16 and 256, right? That's to me in my head right now. That should be enough. But I'm open to anything. Philip, go ahead.
So at first glance, this seems a reasonable proposal, but I'm a bit worried. The thing that we currently have is that we want to introduce a DELEG record, and at least authoritative servers, current existing authoritative servers, don't know what to do with that type. So we want to say, okay, we future-proof it. And then if you look at the difference between the SRV record and the SVCB record, it's that the world has completely changed. The authors of the SRV record could not predict what the SVCB record was going to look like. And I'm a bit afraid that we are doing the same thing, that we are saying a DELEG 2 will be the same as DELEG as we understand it today, but just slightly different. And probably the future DELEG 2 will be so radically different from what we have now that we cannot predict it. Otherwise, we would take it into account. So I'm not so sure that this is actually a good idea, because it assumes that we can predict what authoritative servers have to do to be future compatible. And to give one example where I think it will also get a bit weird, is that we now have a DE bit where we say, okay, you need to serve DELEG and don't serve NS records if this bit is set. What do we do with this bit? Does it mean serve all future DELEG types, or does it mean serve only the latest, or do we need to have still an infinite number of DE bits, one for each type? So I'm a bit afraid that we make space for future extensibility that we're never ever going to use because it's the wrong type of extensibility.
All right. My response to that is it costs very little to assign a range instead of a single type if we do that right now. It's going to cost a whole lot of more if we do this whole scaffolding retrofitting thing to allow for a new type in the future. It's going to cost a whole lot more to do that again. To the DE bit question, yes, if the DE bit is set, serve all authoritative delegation types, right? From DS to DELEG to DELEG 5 to DELEG++, whatever we have defined by then in the future, if any. So that whole range, anything that's present in the zone for that whole range, serve it.
I want to push back against the concept that this is almost for free, because currently, if you have a DELEG record, then you're not going to include an NSEC record because you serve a DELEG record. With this proposal, if you serve a DELEG record, you also serve an NSEC record to prove that the other types are not don't exist. So it's definitely not for free.
That is correct. I wanted to. That's actually in the slide that I said. When the DE bit is set, you will always return an NSEC record to prove absence or presence of any of the types that are available. So currently, remember, without DELEG, you just have, right, DS is the only type that's authoritative on a delegation point. If you serve an NS record and a DS record, you do not serve an NSEC record. Right, so we can't prove if there are any other delegation types there. And the point being is you can't ask for it because you will get back a delegation, right? So my point is, if we do this for the future, we need to always return an NSEC record or an NSEC 3 record in a delegation response. So that is a change indeed from the current draft. So you're right for that specific point.
Thanks, Roy. Andre, go ahead, please.
So this is Andre ISC. I think thinking about it a little bit more, what Eric said, that this doesn't belong here, but into some DNS more general thing makes sense, because we keep going in circles calling this, if there would be DELEG 2 or DELEG 3. I actually think this is more useful for like generic parent site types. And we should and if you stop thinking it about as a tool for this work, as a tool for a DELEG, then it makes sense to move it to, well, DNS op or the new offspring or the DNS op that might happen very soon, because it is about extending the protocol with the new parent types, not about the delegation. The DELEG is the user of this, and it is not going to be inherited into the document that it's about delegation. It's not about delegation. It's about parent types that need special handling. And if we have a block of our types that require special handling, we can implement this now into our implementations and not worry in the future. And I think that's the reason for this draft.
That's correct. I also want to avoid using the term parent because it makes a zone special. It assumes that all zones have parents and not all zone 1 have parents. So it's really records that only live at a delegation point. So in that sense, it looks like DELEG is somehow the right working group. But if we do a whole range of things that might not be useful for a delegation, but live at parent signed only, yeah, then DNS ops. Go ahead.
All right. Go ahead.
Hello, this is Ulrich from ICANN. Actually, your proposal to me doesn't sound at all like it is about code points. It sounds to me that you're defining a set of records that share some properties, and any future record that's supposed to share those properties should get this special handling that we define for this set of records. And the range of code points is totally irrelevant, because we could have disparate code points like 1,000, 1 million, and still have the same handling of them. So what we basically do is to say, we have this set of records that we want this handling for, and we don't want to define this special handling every time we do a new record type.
Exactly.
So, and so I think that is the more important part of this whole proposal than the number of code points that we're going to reserve for it.
Yes, if I were king, I would call this protocol modifications for delegation extensions, and not specifically talk about DELEG at all. This is not about the RR type DELEG, it's about the modifications we need to do, including the one for DELEG, that we should have done for DS in the past, right? Allowing a range, so you're absolutely correct. Oh, disclaimer, we happen to work for the same company, so.
All right, just noting that the queue is locked because we're running up a little bit against our agenda time, but Peter, go ahead, please.
I want to react to Philip's comment that once the range is established, we will always have an NSEC. And I want to point out that once we have authoritative service servers which do support DELEG, but at that point in time, we will not see that much of DELEG records in the zones file, right? Most of the zones will have only NS and no DELEG. And at that point in time, we will get the extra NSEC anyway, even if we use only a single number instead of a range, because by definition, the NSEC has to be there. So I think that we are not really buying that much, unless we assume that other delegations will have DELEG very soon on them, but there will be no material difference between having a range and having only one number when I look at it from the packet size perspective. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter. Q, go ahead, please.
Just a very quick comment on, I think this is a good idea. It would be nice to not have to constantly go, oh, this type also needs special handling because it's in the parent, not the child. We have a lot of RR types available. We should err on the side of reserving a larger range than a smaller range. 256 seems reasonable, whatever. Pick a reasonably large number so we don't run up into, we're running out of space here, just in case.
Thank you. Yeah. Roy, welcome to make the last word here.
Thanks, Q, for that. I agree, but the reason I'm coming back, I thought I was done, but there's one thing lingering in the air. How do we go from here? Is it something I can leave to you guys to hash out?
Sure.
Yeah. Perfect. Thank you.
Yes. So Roy, I actually stuck a comment in the chat that the 2 questions for this working group will be, is there interest in allocating such a range? And if so, how big that range should be? And we will kick that off on the mailing list. Well, we can do that after we figure out if there's consensus to do this.
All right, so moving on the agenda, we have a presentation from Paul. Welcome, Paul.
Since my job, Paul Hoffman, since my job today is to remind people of really big topics that got brought up, but then we ran away from. One thing that we need to consider strongly before we can say this is what the protocol looks like is, what do resolvers do when they get a DELEG include? And now from discussion earlier today, we can see that people want different things in the include, but So what we have in the current draft is that when a resolver sees a DELEG with an include type, it sends a query for the target name of that record with a type of SVCB to get the information that it needs. The draft doesn't say much about that because the draft has been assuming so far that the DELEG record type has many of the same semantics as SVCB, and that's what would happen if you were in the SVCB world. But some people off and on during this discussion have objected to the use of SVCB for include targets. I will talk about that here without saying we should do this or we must do that. But this context, which is the current draft, has a way of doing things. So I'm not proposing something additional. It would be a replacement. Okay, so you can either do SVCB, as the current draft says, or something else. I'm just going to have 2 slides here. This is what we currently have. The next slide will be the something else. So using SVCB for the delegated information, it currently has the same record format as the DELEG RR. So you're going to get the same kinds of information. And DNS software has already caught up with SVCB. The name servers, the resolvers, such like that, they all are familiar with SVCB and the HTTPS type, which is identical to SVCB, which for those of you who look at like resolver logs and such, you will see is a gigantic portion of the query space. You know, it went from 0 before SVCB to like a huge portion. So, you know, it's already known. The disadvantage of using SVCB is that it comes with the same semantic difference that the DELEG RR has. And many people have said that they are uncomfortable with some of the ways we currently define the DELEG RR, which is it's just like SVCB, except for this semantic difference over here and this semantic difference over here and such. Keeping the SVCB record type identical would be lovely, but we have differences that the working group has agreed on. And so what we have now is essentially a diff. Using SVCB for the delegated information would take the same diff. That's a good thing, but we're already moving away from the SVCB things. One of the things that's not even mentioned in the draft is that if you follow the RFCs, when you are following one for a DNS server, you're actually supposed to prepend _DNS dot and do that. I have talked to a few people in the last 2 weeks about what's in the current draft, and it is split exactly 50-50 of whether you were supposed to prepend DNS or not. Completely unclear. It can be specified, but there is disagreement conceptually about what we're doing in DELEG for those going out and finding delegated information. The other thing that I consider really important is we are now going to, with SVCB for types, just in the same way we have with DELEG, they were saying, oh, we'll reuse the key value pairs from SVCB. And, you know, okay, we're going to rename the IP address names. Now we're going to have to also redo the thing for transports because there's no way in the ALPN extension in the transports to say, I want to do plain. I don't want to have this protected. There's no way to say I'm going to do DO53. So now we would be introducing another one because we know here that one of the things that's going to happen after we deploy DELEG, some name servers are going, you know, that do secure transport are also going to do not secure transport. That we're going to say this name server over here will do port 53 and DOQ or whatever, you know, it'll do both. We can't do that right now. So yes, we can say, oh, here's another difference, but now we are just piling on differences, which takes us to, if we have a new RR type, instead of using SVCB, we can have the new RR type say exactly what it is doing. That is, that the new RR type can say, DELEG is only going to appear at delegation. I am only going to be here. I am not causing a delegation. I am just here to say what kind of name server that I have. So also, if the DELEG working group decides not to make DELEG be exactly SVCB and changes, it to something else with a different wire format, we can exactly match that here as well. So the con in the previous slide is the equivalent of the pro here. Now, one of the cons here is that I am suggesting another record type. This just makes things a little bit more complicated. It's a separate record type with identical semantics to the record that we've already been working on, that we're going to continue to work on. And this last bullet point is not humorous. Already in the last couple of weeks, as I have talked to people about, oh, well, what if we do this? There's been like 5 different names, including, oh no, that name sucks. So we will bike shed on this, and that is a negative. We already have, we could call it SVCB2 if we really wanted to piss people off. But this is, and this is it. This is it for my slides. I think we can have some mic time depending, but this is the kind of thing that has to be on the list with people making specific suggestions about what we want to do. And that's it. Seriously, I just had one pro and one con for each of those two. And by the way, people are free to disagree with my pros and cons. Just that's where we're at.
All right. Thanks, Paul.
Sure.
We've got a little queue already. So Victor, go ahead, please.
Sure. Paul, I'm very much confused about incompatibility between service B and what's needed here, because certainly the key space for service B has room for 65,000 keys. If we don't like any of the existing keys and we want to slightly alter them, we just introduce a new key with similar payloads. Servers don't necessarily need to understand every key. They can be opaque to the server. So if you want a new transport key that supports No53, just define a new key type. The only thing that's frozen in stone about service B is the target and the alias mode, 0 versus higher than 0 bits. Everything else is definable as you want, right?
So, but Victor, you just hit the nail on the head with the thing you said at the very end, which is that service B, as it stands, doesn't just have alias mode and such. It has a range of priorities, which this working group has decided we're not interested in. So we're not interested in the priorities for DELEG, but if we say do a service B request, we are now outside of DELEG space again, because we have different semantics, different requirements.
It's not the key value pairs. It's the core properties of a service B.
It's both, because many people are saying we can reuse the key value pairs. And so far, we've been able to literally reuse 0 of them. At least for our current agreements. Maybe the working group switches back to saying some of those are okay, and it's okay to call this a hint, and it's okay to have an ALPN where we cannot specify standard DNS. But currently, with what the working group is saying we want, we are not reusing any of the key value pairs, and we have changed the meaning of one of the 2 other fields in the record type. And then there was discussion today of actually changing another one to allow a dot in the name. So reuse, the word reuse is being stretched pretty widely.
All right. Thanks. We'll go to Ben next.
Hey.
You have light behind you.
It's possible that I disagree with every point.
Yes, it is absolutely possible.
In this analysis. So I don't have any fixed opinion on what RR type should exist in this place, but I don't think these are the right bases on which to make that decision. The prefix thing, we can decide whatever we want. I don't think it's of any significant importance. Probably no prefix. The priorities, I do think are useful. Like, I think it's a mistake to drop that here. The example that I'll give you is as somebody who's been operating a large-scale DNS service in-house, the idea of outsourcing it to a third party is something that is hard to imagine for a variety of reasons. But I think would be a lot more appealing if it could be done as a backup in a way that only gets used if essentially the in-house operated name servers are down. That's something that's inexpressible in today's DNS, and so I think and so we don't do anything like that. But if we had priorities, then ideally we would be able to say, well, our name servers are the top priority, use them. If they somehow fall off the internet, here's a backup. The transport parameters and the ability to express DO53, I don't think there's any significant challenge here. I've written in the transport draft originally a proposal on GitHub for how you might spell this. There are lots of ways that you can spell it. I don't think we need to argue about that, but you can certainly spell it without having to throw out the existing ALPN descriptor system. I think almost all of the existing defined service params for service B are relevant to DELEG, and the ones that we know about for the future are also potentially relevant. So I think it would be a real mistake to try to fork that registry, essentially. The best way to think about the service B parameter registry is that it is the designated place for setting up TLS and quick connections. And while that doesn't have anything to do with DNS directly, as long as you want to run DNS over TLS or quick, you want the service B service params registry, and you're going to want to use it directly and not have to duplicate it, because TLS and quick are evolving pretty fast. So in terms of what RR type to use here, I don't particularly care, but whatever we use, I think it needs to have a lot in common with service B as it's defined today.
So one thing I said at the beginning, when Ben said, could we disagree on everything? And I said, yes. What he just finished up with, I agree with. If this working group comes to a decision to make the DELEG record type be identical in semantics to SVCB, then it is just fine to have the thing that we are chasing and include BSVCB. Because my belief is you want to have exactly the same semantics in the DELEG record as in whatever it is that you're going to chase down. You don't want resolvers to have to think, oh, wait, I got that from on the parent side, especially because we can mix record types, right? That a resolver might end up in its cache for this name with some things that came from DELEG records and some things that came from the chased records. I want those to be identical. I was about to say as identical as possible. That's not what I want. I want identical between them so that someone writing a resolver doesn't have to do any interpolation. So again,
So I don't think I agree with that either. I think there are a bunch of situations where there are things that you want to only be able to say on the parent side, and that it doesn't make sense.
I would want to see that list.
Sure. The first thing that comes to mind is the debound style annotations, where the parent says, by the way, this is an arm's length delegation. And the child zone here is operationally very tightly connected to me. You should think of it as part of the same operational zone, or operationally distant from me. You should think of it like a public suffix.
Okay, I can see a reason because of a DELEG chain to wanting that on the child side as well. This parent said that about me, but I'm not doing it anymore. I have delegated all of my operations out to a third place.
Okay, I think we may have at some point discussed other, like whether you could CNAME a DELEG.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's in there. Yeah.
All right.
So,
But okay.
Let's move on and give Eric's been very patient. Eric, go ahead, please.
Eric Nygren. I generally agree with Ben on a number of the things. Like I agree on trying to keep the registry the same if we can, and keeping it, like at least trying to keep the semantics as close as we and syntax as close as we can, even if we diverge. But I think on the point of should the target of an include be a SVCB or some new record type, I think it probably is better there to include to use a new record type that's with a to be bike shedded name, because I think as we go forwards, it's going to be simpler if there are some variations there, and as well as this topic of synthesis has come up, and if we ever need to do synthesis there, having a separate record type is going to make it a lot easier for synthesis to be done in a deterministic manner than if it's an SVCB where it's going to be really unclear when it is or isn't safe to do the synthesis because you don't have the context. So I think from that perspective, having that target be a separate record type will be cleaner. I think on the priorities one, I think that's probably a topic for us to come back to. I agree with Ben that I think there are cases for priorities, although my use cases for it are different than the ones he was raising.
Thanks, Eric. Wes?
Wes Hardiker, still no hats. So countering what I said before, this actually to me has a clear demonstration of need, right? I mean, you articulated a large number of, we keep wandering away from this other format. So to me, this is a clear statement. I think as even Ben hinted at the end, just because we are going to change some things doesn't mean we can't reuse portions of the code base or whatever. And so certainly as we go forward, we should look toward maximizing what we can that is reusable, even if we end up needing to differentiate among some things.
Right.
So to me, a new RR type chasing a new mechanism is probably the right thing to do, but we should ideally stick to a similar chasing algorithm, which I think you hinted to as well.
Sure, the chasing algorithm is just fine. It's just a question of what do you send out when you are chasing.
All right, Philip, go ahead.
I think it will help implementing resolvers and stuff and understanding the system as a whole if the DELEG record, well, the one that we have in the parent, is very similar to what we have as a target of the DELEG include. If those have two completely different semantics, and the further DELEG moves away from SVCB, basically the harder it will get to understand what the system is really doing, because you have to have two completely different resource records in mind when you're trying to understand what the DELEG really means. So I think that it's a good proposal to move to a separate type, at least for the moment, and just try to keep the DELEG and the other type in sync as much as possible. And then, of course, reuse stuff from SVCB, but not try to shoehorn stuff in SVB if it really becomes awkward.
Thanks, Philip. And Victor?
If the new record type is structurally isomorphic to service B, but just differs in the interpretation of the parts, I think that's a lot easier to manage. We already have HTTPS and service B that are different code points, but isomorphic structurally. So if all we want to do is impose slightly different interpretations on exactly the same data layout, I think that is easy to defend. Is there anything about the service B structure, semantics aside, that's not suitable for handling this?
I can answer your last question, which is, so far, the discussion of priority in the working group has been most people who responded on that thread were happy with us getting rid of priority. There are some people who are not. Ben was not, he stated it again. But because of that, if we get rid of priority on the DELEG side, I would hope we would get rid of priority on the chased child side, or now you have the resolver is going to have to mix some records, which it got from the parent side, that have no priorities with priorities that they got from the child side. Because please remember, these are not individual records. These are our sets. And we explicitly allow, currently, maybe the working group wants to change it, but we currently allow an RR set that has a direct and an indirect record in it. And I think that makes great sense. I don't want the semantics of is there priority or not to be split.
All right.
I don't have to do my last one if you want to do, because mine, that's like information. If you want to do more stuff here, we can just throw that the transport stuff. Okay. Yeah.
All right, thanks everyone for the discussion. So some of our takeaways for today are we need to have more discussion about Roy's proposal for the range of parent-side types. Obviously, we need to have more discussion about what Paul just stated about, you know, code points and record types for included names. And is there anything, I know we've only got, I think, one representative from the base spec author pool here, but is there any questions you guys have for the group? Tail, do you have good direction for going forward? Yeah, you're good? Okay. What else, Brian?
Petter actually made this comment in chat, and I just wanted to emphasize this for everybody else, that the important part seems to be that we need to figure out what the semantics are, and then we'll figure out what the format looks like. So if we can stay away from arguing about service B, service C, I think we'll be better off, because if we can define those semantics, then we can all agree on what we're trying to accomplish.
All right, anything else before we wrap up? Any last comments or questions?
Yeah, you know, like I said earlier, Dwayne and I will kick off a couple of questions on the mailing list so that we can actually have targeted discussions, one around the range or reserving a range of RR types, recognizing that we don't know if we do that here or in DNS op. And then I think the other part of it is getting some focus on the semantics and working through the details.
All right. Then I guess we're done a little bit early. So we'll see you all in the hallway for the break. Thank you.
Thanks all.
I could use an app now. So,